Hello and welcome to AviaDev Insight Africa, the podcast offering a window to the world of African aviation with your host, John Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa. Today, we are diving into a topic that is more relevant than ever as we navigate the dynamic realities of aviation on the African continent. Over the last couple of years, I've been reading up and increasing my knowledge of the aviation finance and leasing landscape, as fleet development has always been intrinsically linked to network development. And of course, at AviaDev, we are completely focused on improving air connectivity to, from, and within the African continent. And we're covering both topics now through the conference itself and through the podcast too. And we're also discussing access to and structuring of acquisitions and leases. So it's really become a big part of what is driving route development. Now, at the end of July, I posted a quote on LinkedIn from the seminal work on aviation fleet planning, which is Paul Clark's amazing book called Buying the Big Jets. Still, it's been in multiple volumes now and been reinvented, but it's still seen as the seminal work for the industry. Paul's quote is as follows: "Planning aircraft size for a market is rather like buying shoes for children. A good fleet plan allows the market to grow into the aircraft just as little feet must grow into shoes. You don't want the shoes to become too small too quickly in a situation of rapid growth. Phasing of capacity to need is very important." So on the back of this post, I received a comment that suggested that we should consider fleet planning more like renting a tuxedo. And so I sat with this idea and extrapolated it into a scenario which can be simplified as follows. We'll go through the full thing, but the post is there in the show notes. So we figured it was event season and you've got a full calendar of different activities. So annual general meetings, very formal, award ceremonies, of course, route inaugurations, and what's going to be required for all of these wonderful cocktail parties is that you're going to need a tuxedo. So the question is, do you really need to own the tuxedo? Do you own a second-hand tuxedo? Or do you just need to look the part, perform, and then hand it back? Now, the post in question received over 15,000 views on the platform, so it's done pretty well, but mostly it got some commentary from some amazing industry commentators and stimulated a healthy debate, and we were challenged to come up with some new analogies. And after this podcast, we will continue to adapt it from that commentary, including some commentary from Paul himself. So today, what I'm going to do is we're going to dive in to debate it, and we're going to do that with the gentleman who provided the initial tuxedo comment, who is Andrew Lester, the ACMI and leasing manager for India, Middle East and Africa at Chapman Freeborn Airchartering, part of Avia Solutions Group. Andrew was with us in AviaDev in Zanzibar, along with Linas, the CCO. And he's a passionate advocate, of course, for ACMI leasing. That, for anybody who is uninitiated, is aircraft crew maintenance and insurance, also known as wet leasing. Now, Andrew's been spending so many years helping operators across the globe and increasingly in Africa understand how ACMI can be a game changer for airlines that want to scale fast, manage risk, and meet demand with precision. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how this model fits Africa's unique market challenges and the opportunities, talking about seasonal peaks, capital constraints, and why sometimes the smartest move isn't to own the tux, but to rent it, wear it well, and make your mark. So lengthy intro, but I'll set the scene properly. And welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you very much, John. And thanks again for a great event that you put on in Zanzibar and your usual input on LinkedIn and all the various Facebook posts and everything else. You certainly add value to the industry and you get people talking, which is what's important. So thank you for having me here.
No, fantastic. And it really is like being in a little club every day when I go on LinkedIn with the people that are there and the interactions that we got. But yeah, I was really pleased with your analogy. And then I sat with it for a good hour or so and obviously shared it with you and said, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? So let's visit that analogy. So it's a metaphor that obviously seems to have captured the imagination. And I think where we need to start for our listeners in the aviation sector is really unpack what ACMI really means in practice and what it actually means and why it might be the perfect fit, if you pardon the pun, for the African region.
100%. John, I think let's start at the basics. There's obviously a lot of industry professionals here, and I don't need to explain what the A, the M, the C, and the I stands for. But for those who don't, let's jump into it very quickly. ACMI is aircraft crew maintenance and insurance. We like to think of it is airline in a box. And it's a real game changer. It's been done in Europe for years. It's a little bit new to the African market, but we see the uptake being a lot better. And it's a profit multiplier for both lessor and lessee. It's a real valid solution. Everybody's chasing capital, chasing assets, which actually are very hard to find because the manufacturers can't deliver new aircraft. Second-hand aircraft on the market are very hard to find. And leases are long-term. Dry leases are long-term. You're looking at 5 to 8 years. ACMI is an option that we can place now. We can make money now, and it's there for when you need it, and it goes away very calmly when you don't.
Yeah, and I love that about that. It's there, and it's an airline in a box is another really nice way to do it. So obviously you get your tux delivered to the door, so you don't even need to go to the tailors. In our analogy, ACMI is like renting the full look. So we say it's the tux, the shirt, the shoes, the cufflinks, everything. But from your perspective, what's the most misunderstood part of this model when you speak to the African airlines and the African markets?
Sure, John. I think let's first say that Africa is starting to bloom. It's the region that shows the most growth. Europe's fine. Middle East is doing well. America's been doing it since 1903. Africa's blooming, and routes are expanding. Airlines are expanding. And this ACMI adds a perfect product to them, because a lot of the time in Africa, when they think of ACMI, they think AOG. And while certainly it has its place there, it's not where it shines fully. When you consider ACMI, and this is what we need to help our African colleagues in the industry, is make them realize that this is a profit-making machine. You don't have the assets, and you don't have the capital for the assets in many things. And capital costs money. When you're taking loans from banks, your assets have to be profitable from day one. Now, in saying this, sure, you've got an aircraft that goes technical or goes in for a C or a D check, and you know it's going to be out of action. We can plan for that. But where it really, really shines is Africa is not a flat market over 12 months. It's got its peaks, it's got its troughs, and it's very seasonal. In fact, we're very lucky that half of the continent sits in the southern hemisphere. So the opposite seasonality, African airlines can pick up exactly the same aircraft from Europe at a much cheaper rate than the Europeans were paying for it, because those aircraft would now potentially sit idle in the IATA winter. So they need to take advantage of that. And if it's planned well in advance, and it's planned with the right partner, A, as a broker, and B, as a lessor and lessee relationship, it can be very profitable for both parties. And in saying that, we've got to get over the misconception that it's only there for AOGs and for emergencies. That's not where it shines. It does work, but it's not where it shines to its full potential. It's when it's planned properly, brought in, again, I keep on going back to this, brought in strategically for X amount of months to operate this program, and then leaves.
Yeah, and I think that's what you've always said. You said this is actually part of a fleet strategy and a network strategy, rather than just being there as a break glass in case of emergency kind of setup. That's how it's often been seen. And I think that we do have to address, of course, the thing that you will get told all the time, which is, oh, this is an expensive option. You can't make money if you operate ACMI because you're paying so much. There are so many airlines out there. They're struggling with aging fleet. They've got high lease costs. They've got very difficult access to capital. And if they can get access to loans, the interest rates are eye-watering in many parts, especially for airlines themselves. And of course, there's limited access to new aircraft. Even if you can raise the money, how do you get it, and when do you get it? How do you plan for that? So that ACMI option is definitely there, but it's often dismissed very quickly as, oh, it's an expensive option. So how do they bridge that gap both affordably and competitively?
John, we can't compare ACMI to dry leasing and to direct ownership. Yes, the ACMI rate is most certainly higher if you compare it hour for hour, but that's not what the product is, and it's not what the product's designed for. ACMI is designed to bring it in when you need it and let go of it. Now, in fact, in Zanzibar, Abdel Rahman from AFRA mentioned that if you ACMI an aircraft for 5 years, you might as well buy your own aircraft. And I have to hand it to him, I agree with him on that point. But You don't need to own that aircraft for every single day of that 5 years with ACMI. I can bring it in on day 270 and I can send it away on day 320. Now, when you compare the hourly rate, divide it amongst the year. So would you rather have assets on the ground, sitting idle, not achieving their peak profit? Because if that's the case, they're actually not assets, they become liabilities. At the end of the day, we have to make money. We have to make money on every single hour. So comparing the hourly rate on a dry lease compared to the hourly rate on a wet lease, sure, there's going to be a difference. But you don't need it for the entire 5 years. You only need it for 2 or 3 months each year for 5 years.
Yeah, I think you've answered the next question, but I still want to ask it because I can hear, and I always cite this individual's name whenever I bring this up, which is Roger Foster, the former CEO of Airlink. And he always talks about balance sheet, owning assets. And there is a focus, and he was, of course, the operator of a private airline, but there's very much a focus on owning assets as a sign of maturity of an airline and a sign of prestige. Like I want to own the car that I drive. I don't want to lease. But somebody driving past or walking past me, they wouldn't know whether that's on a hire purchase, a PCP, a loan, or whether I bought it outright cash. That mindset often sits in the boardroom, but it also sits with the CFO saying, we want assets, we want something that sits on our balance sheet. So how do you balance that conversation? How do you address it when they equate ownership and control? They think ownership means control, ownership means that I've got that balance.
The fact that it came from Roger Foster, it already bears a lot of gravitas, because the fact that he was in business for that long, started an airline from scratch and taken it to where it is now, people should listen. Now, 100%, you don't need to own the assets to be able to make money out of them. Hey, the guy getting on the aircraft, we would put your livery on the side of the aircraft if we had to, if the ACMI lease was long enough, even for 3 months or 4 months, it just bears a cost. But having 10 aircraft on your inventory means nothing. It's the bottom line that counts. Profit is what counts. So bragging about how many aircraft an airline has can actually be detrimental. It's how much money do you make per hour of that aircraft flying. That's what's important, and that's what affects the bottom line. Now, there is certainly this mentality of we've got to own or acquire more aircraft. There is a scenario that you could end up owning too much metal, because you've got an airline that has X amount of demand and you've got X amount of capacity. Anything above between the demand and the capacity line, you will be running at a loss. It's fact that airlines globally only make money 3-4 months of the year. Now, if you look at this, that means that you have to make enough money for those 3 or 4 months of the year to compensate for the loss that you run for the other 8 months. Now, again, this is when you bring it in for demand, because during those peak season, ticket prices are up, demand is hot, so you have to make as much money over that period of time. And you do not want to own the assets the rest of the year, because they are liabilities, they are cash burners. You do not want them.
That's exactly it. That's the tuxedo. That's why the tuxedo works so well as a metaphor, because it's a time of year that there's event season, it's the end of year awards, it's whatever it is, and you've got a decision to make, and it's exactly the same. So I think you've delivered that. But what I really want to do is let's take it to real life, and let's apply this to Africa as well. So success stories in Africa where ACMI has actually helped an airline survive or even thrive in a difficult competitive market environment. Give us an example.
If we look at Lift / Global in the southern tip of Africa, my home country, Lift does not own one single aircraft. They started in the midst of the pandemic when everything was against them and they should have failed. Now, interestingly, Lift, one of the founders of Lift was Jonathan Ayachi, who is ex-Uber. He brought that Uber mindset that we don't need to own the aircraft. So what did they do? They had an agreement with Global, a very good ACMI provider in the southern tip of Africa. And they said, hold on, we'll apply the Uber mindset of we'll be the front as Lyft. We don't need to own the cars. We don't need to own the drivers. We'll make that Global's problem. And Global's very good at what they do. Look at where Lyft is today. Now, post-pandemic, they are really they're growing every single day. The demands are getting higher. And that is a success story in Africa. And it doesn't end there. We look at Uganda Airlines. They have Africa's youngest fleet with the A330s and their CRJ 900s. Now, they are looking at purchasing more aircraft, and don't get me wrong, purchasing and dry lease has its place, but it has to be for your flatline demand, that demand that you can use the entire year round. What do they do for their peak seasons? They get hold of an external airline, and they say, bring your airline for this 4 months of the year or this 6 months of the year. Now, that is the right way of thinking. Guess what? Go and look at those airlines' balance sheets and their financials. They're doing well.
Yeah, I think it's a great story. So yeah, the Lift story is one that's really close to me because I was one of the first people to interview Gidon Novik, who was the co-founder with Jonathan, and obviously Gidon cut his teeth at Kalula, the low-cost arm of Comair. They were just as well really smart to see this as a marketing opportunity. Even the name was crowdsourced by the public. They said, "What should we call this airline?" And it created an ability for people to submit their responses, to get in the newspaper, and it was a smart way to get PR. I've interviewed Gidon and I've interviewed John as well on the podcast, so people can go back and have a listen. But the interview with Gidon was back right when they launched. It was the middle of the pandemic. We obviously did it remotely, and he was very open, and he's done amazing stuff as well. Yeah, a really interesting way to look at it. So we'll come to some more of those examples shortly. But what I wanted to do was just step back, look at this from your perspective, and when you're engaging with African Airlines, talk to us about the top 3 things that would make them a candidate for ACMI partnership. And that means obviously what they've got going for them and what you're looking for as well.
John, I don't think there's 3 things. I think we can narrow it down to 1 thing. And now when we talk about a partnership, we're talking about lessor and lessee. The most important thing is opposite seasonality. So we would take an aircraft from the Northern Hemisphere, from ER to summer, and we would look for a partner to form this partnership with in the southern part of the globe, Australia, Southern Africa, South America. So it's opposite seasonality. For the relationship to work, you need one partner to have a peak season when the other airline doesn't. And that makes a perfect partnership. And ultimately, we've got to start thinking without emotions. Do we need to own the aircraft? Yes, it's very nice to say I own 150 aeroplanes. How many of them are profitable? So that is how we have to look at these relationships. But your main one is opposite seasonality, because both parties benefit from each other, and it's a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, and I think this is something that I am super interested to talk more about, is that flipping the script. And we've talked about this on the podcast. We've talked about this a lot, about European airlines deploying their sort of season capacity. So we've seen SAA working with Sun Express. So Sun Express, Turkish, part of the Lufthansa group, you know, what they've got is high demand in summer, but they've got 737s. They want to do something with them. They put them into South Africa. They've got an agreement. Everybody benefits. But what I'm really interested in, isn't this an opportunity? We've talked about ACMI as a way to bring aircraft in. Isn't this an opportunity for some of the operators in Europe, in Africa, to say, look, in our winter, we could deploy this to the Northern Hemisphere for their summer, because we're not getting what we want from this asset. Why don't we actually turn ACMI to our advantage? Is that something you're pushing, you're seeing, you're hearing about, you think could be a trend?
So in Europe, it's done all the time. But again, in Africa, we're busy helping our partners down there learn this. Now, in every scheduled airline, there's an ACMI airline in there somewhere. Definitely. When you get to your low season, you have to look at your fleet, you have to look at your loads, and you have to say, hold on, do I really need all of this? And if you don't, lease that aircraft out on a wet lease, ACMI lease to somebody again. It's a huge, again, I go to this term profit multiplier. It's your aircraft have to fly, and they have to fly profitably. So certainly every single African airline needs to look at ACMI out. ACMI in, when you've got the peak, and during your troughs, you ACMI out. This is why dealing with companies like ours, we're the middleman. We're the guy that takes the tuxedo from this guy and says, hold on, this is the perfect tuxedo. The guy that wore it last week went to look great, or last summer was great. He had all these photographs on the red carpet. The size matches yours perfectly. You take it now.
Yeah, and we did a session at Aviadev, and the title was Sweating the Asset. And this was part of that conversation, but I really think I'm not sure that actually came up as a potential solution here. And I just think what an amazing opportunity and something for us to watch and to discuss in more detail as we go, definitely. But what I want to do before we leave is I definitely want to talk a bit more about regulation and the role of governments, because we have seen some news stories where African airlines have got ACMI aircraft, but then they've been denied traffic rights because that isn't on their registry. It's all very complex, but ultimately, if the airline can't operate that aircraft due to a regulatory legislative reason, that's a real difficult thing. So what can the regulators do? And are there any particular examples where this is really hurting or really helping, and where you've got countries doing more or less on the African continent? Because I do read a lot of these stories and you think that's ridiculous. The plane's there, the demand's there, and the airline's not able to fly that route.
I think we need to look at mindset here. Airlines and GDP are 100% connected. Now, and we face it a lot in Africa, where your authorities and your regulations, all of them allow it to a certain degree, but it's the process to be able to get it approved. Now, in order for a European airline to operate in, say, South Africa, you need to get what we call a foreign operator's permit. Now, in Europe, from country to country, we can have this done in, and I'm not kidding, no less than 7 days. In Africa, it's a different story. There's other certain laws that don't make sense. In certain countries, you can ACMI for 6 months and then no more. Why would you do that? Because if it's making money, and it's not just making money for the airline. Generally, the more people that fly in and out of a country, the better it is for GDP. You're talking about airlines, those are business people up and down. Talking about cargo, huge profit generator for a country, certainly. And if there's anybody listening from an authority around Africa, we welcome you. And it costs nothing. Our phones are open. Our phones are on. Give us a shout. And let's hold a workshop for you and explain how it's done. And let's see, without obviously exposing extra risks, doing things properly. But there is a way to do it all the way around the year, and to be able to get it authorized, so to speak, from an authority to be able to do it quickly. Another thing is that all our airlines, our group airlines, are IOSA. Now, IOSA is like the gold standard. And we've got to look at that. So when you're dealing with an IOSA operator, theoretically, it should be a lot quicker to onboard and get authorized and for the foreign operator's permit in order for it to operate. But we certainly got a lot of work to do, and we are actively doing it with various authorities on the continent.
I think the thing you've hit on there from a regulation perspective is we do a lot of work with AFCAC, who are obviously in charge of getting SATAM up and running. And of course, Funke's done a great job with the idea of the pilot implementation and really focusing on fifth freedom routes and getting things going. Because what I know from a network perspective is you can start a route with a fifth freedom, so where you have a middle point. Correct. And then you separate that route off and fly direct. Now, the reason I bring that up here is this is an ACMI opportunity to be a network builder, right? Where you can, for a short period, say, hey, we'd like to test that route for 2 months. Oh my goodness, it's doing well. And then they might say, we actually now will go to a dry lease, or we'll extend the ACMI. So, ACMI here as well can be a network and connectivity builder too. It's not just there to fill in, like we say, break glass in case of emergency kind of thing.
This is exactly where it shines. When you go buy a car, do you take it for a test drive around the block for an hour or two, or do you drive it for a month? You don't. You drive it again for a couple of hours. Perhaps if the salesman's really nice, he'll let you take it for a speed run down the highway. But for testing routes, that, let's face it, there's always a risk involved that it doesn't actually work out. Lease one of our aircraft, or lease a aircraft in on wet lease that brings the crew, everything else, and test it out. If it works and you can see that you're going to have stable demand over the next couple of years, then you move from ACMI to dry lease or to outright purchase.
Yeah, it's a life cycle. It's a spectrum of options. That's why in my head, I can't understand why there'd be a limit, because surely that's in the eye of the beholder of the operator. If the operator can make money and wants to do something a certain way, it understands that, right, I sit down, and this is what you learn in the aircraft financing, leasing side is you sit down, you look at your model and you say, what works for me? What works for me now based on the market conditions? We talked about the problems that we have, that if you buy a new aircraft today, you could be waiting 8, 9 years to actually be able to operate. So for most airlines, they need the capacity to be deployed quickly. And that makes ACMI more of an option, or of course, dry leasing or second-hand ownership. All of those things have a place, but it's about understanding what the needs are and proving. I always think one way of looking at this is it's proving a concept. We think this route might work. How do we do that low risk? We get an ACMI, we try it, we test it, we sell it. The yields are better than we thought. Right, let's do it, or let's deploy one of our aircraft, whatever it may be, or let's just do it every year seasonally. So you'll see some of these agreements that from the end of November till the end of January, peak season down in South Africa, for example, that's the time when we're going to need that capacity. And if we commit that we can do this for a longer period, we'll get a better rate from the brokers. And we'll be seen as a better partner. And it's the partnership of, hey, this doesn't have to be a one-off. This can be a seasonal programmatic strategy as part of your network and your fleet.
Correct.
So I think before we go, I did one last thing. Again, is I don't want to get you in trouble, but some of the cautionary tales and the things that have happened when ACMI is either done wrong and it's not performed for an airline, or ultimately African operators can learn from examples where there's been experiences that haven't been so positive.
So listen, in every industry, we've got our ups and we've got our downs, and there have been a couple of clangers. Aircraft that arrive and, like we've just covered, actually can't operate for 3 or 4 months because the authority hasn't allowed. And this is when getting an experienced broker is money well spent. It costs very little because it's built into the lease rates, but we also are in touch with the regulators, the leasor and the leasee. So, you can overcome these. And what we do is we approach the market strategically. If an airline had to go and want to secure ACMI themselves, what they do is they blind carbon copy 452 different airlines and say, hey, we need this. And it creates havoc in the market. I don't know if you've ever watched the movie Rat Race, where they say, it's a race, and people go mad. Okay, that is what you want to avoid. We add value because we approach the market strategically. We know what prices you should be paying. We negotiate on your behalf. We look at the terms and conditions. We say, this is what they're offering. We basically act like a marriage counselor between them. And that's when things happen right. So certainly things can go wrong if it's done not carefully and not strategically planned. But when they go right, they make you money.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing. It's having that expert in your corner who can see round those corners and say, look, just because you want X have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And of course, the airlines will take you more seriously. You know what's the right rate to pay. You can advise your client in that way. But of course, you're benefiting from both sides. Say it's built into the lease rate, the fact that you've done this, and whatever it makes sense. But they shouldn't be doing this without some expert support if they haven't done it time and time again, or if it's not a partner airline or whatever it may be, or somebody within their alliance or whatever it may be anyway. So it's always good to have that second opinion. I think we all know that when it comes to getting a new mortgage on your house or something, you're not just going to just go to the bank and say, can I have a new one? You want to go to a broker, look at the market, but get them to do the heavy lifting and then come to you and say, here's option 1, here's option 2, here's option 3. And actually for your circumstance, this is probably the best fit. Now leave it to us. We'll sort it out. And actually these guys are going to pay us really for placing that business, etc. And it's a bit of a no-brainer, and it's a growing part of the industry that we can't ignore because of the challenges we have when it comes to acquisition and lease rates, when it comes to availability of aircraft. It's as simple as that. I think the final question I've got for you is, what will you be doing next time it's event season and you need a tuxedo? What's your plan?
John, I very seldom wear a tux myself, but what I am is I work for a world leader when it comes to tux rentals and tux procurement. So I'm the guy that doesn't necessarily wear the tux, but I pass it from one leaser to the next. And that's what I'm doing between it. I'm also the guy that accompanies them on the date, and I make sure it goes well. And at the end of the season, I make sure that they're ready for dating season next year again. So that's what I do, John.
No, I love it. And that was Patrick Edmonds' comment, wasn't it? Was that actually you're hiring somebody to wear the tuxedo on your behalf. It's not even you that's wearing it. But I think this whole analogy has been really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to kind of extrapolating it and getting more and more input into it. And yeah, thank you for being a great guest, and thank you for filling us in on this side of things. And yeah, we'll continue the conversation. And thanks for your support for AviaDev as well, Andrew. It's been great chatting to you.
Thank you, John, on all fronts. Thank you, from a great program with AviaDev and the bench to your podcast, to all the different platforms that you add value. Thank you very much. And I really do appreciate what you're doing for us and the industry.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. For everybody out there listening, if you did enjoy this, if there's somebody in your network you think would benefit from listening, do hit the share button now, share it with that person. Subscribe as well on any platform that, of course, you're listening to or you're watching to, as on YouTube as well, is available there. I will put Andrew's contact details in the show notes, so you can go straight there and email him or get him on LinkedIn. And yeah, we'll be back for a few weeks. I've got a vacation planned, and then back in September, we'll be back with a whole new series of podcasts as we carry on through the year into the second half of event season, actually, for me in September, October, November. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody in person again. And thank you all for joining us. We'll be back very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.